I wasn't trying to uncover anything when I started this. I was documenting European royal marriages, Habsburgs, Romanovs, Windsors, standard genealogical research. Then I kept hitting the same wall. The maternal lines stop. Not gradually, not from poor record keeping, but cleanly, as if it had been wiped from the historical record. That stood out because these families documented everything else obsessively: hunting accidents, property disputes, minor titles, illegitimate children. Yet the bloodlines of the women who bore their heirs simply stop. Why would families whose authority rested on bloodline purity accept brides they couldn't fully trace? And when you map where the documentation stops, where these women came from before their names entered royal records, the gaps don't scatter randomly. They cluster, pointing to the same territories that appear on 18th century maps with borders and cities, then systematically vanish during the exact decades these genealogies were being locked into official history. The families knew where these women came from, so why wasn't it written down? Starting with the Romanovs. The dynasty ruled Russia from 1613 to 1917. And their official genealogies trace lineage through documented succession with the kind of precision you'd expect from a family whose legitimacy depended entirely on bloodline claims. Marriage certificates, birth records, succession documents, all meticulously preserved. But look at the women who married into the family during the consolidation period of the 1600s and 1700s, particularly those whose children would become czars. And a pattern appears almost immediately. Their own ancestry before these marriages becomes difficult to verify beyond 1 or 2 generations. Not impossible, just uncertain enough that most historians accept official explanations without pushing further. The British royal transition to the House of Hanover in 1714 follows the same structure: Protestant succession, parliamentary approval, legitimate claims through Stuart ancestry, all properly documented. But trace the Hanoverian line back into the German principalities, and something begins to stand out. Many of these territories had undergone recent dynastic changes just 1 or 2 generations earlier, with new families appearing, new heraldic symbols adopted, and new genealogies formalized within a compressed time frame, as if being positioned for roles they would soon need to fill. Individually, each case seems plausible. Noble lines died out. Inheritances reshuffled claims. Political marriages rearranged power, the standard evolution of aristocratic families across centuries. But when the same pattern repeats across multiple royal houses in different countries, all during the same narrow window, when power was being consolidated in specific hands, it stops looking like normal variation and starts looking coordinated. And these families documented everything that mattered to their authority with obsessive precision. They could trace cousins 5 times removed. They maintained records of illegitimate children who would never affect succession. They tracked horse lineages more carefully than common families tracked their own. Yet the maternal ancestry of the women whose bloodlines would directly determine who ruled empires becomes impossible to verify at the exact point where that verification would establish where these families actually came from. The genealogies all point to the same thing: ancestry that stops precisely where it would reveal something. Now look at what these families built during this exact period. Not inherited castles, but palaces constructed as statements of authority. The Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, massively expanded during the 1700s. Schönbrunn in Vienna, extensively expanded during the same period. The Royal Palace in Madrid, constructed after a fire in 1734, destroyed the previous Habsburg residence. And Buckingham Palace in London, heavily modified. All of these projects unfolded between roughly 1700 and 1780, and all share something that goes beyond architectural fashion. Stand in front of the Winter Palace and study how height relates to width, how columns are spaced, how visual weight is distributed, and how mathematical precision governs window placement and geometric relationships across the facade. Now compare it to Schönbrunn or the Royal Palace in Madrid. And you're not seeing buildings that merely share influence. You're seeing the same proportional systems applied again and again, the same engineering principles governing load distribution, and the same geometric logic shaping how space feels, and imposing, controlled, and deliberately authoritative. This isn't cultural exchange, spreading gradually through travelling architects. It's identical technical knowledge, appearing simultaneously across projects, supposedly designed independently for rival dynasties. And that knowledge doesn't look experimental or developing. It appears fully formed, sophisticated, and capable of managing construction at enormous scale without regional variation or trial and error. It looks transmitted, as if these architects weren't inventing systems, but executing principles already worked out elsewhere. The genealogies suggest these families share ancestry they can't acknowledge. The architecture shows they share technical knowledge that had to come from somewhere. Now look at the maps. Pull up cartographic records from the 1600s and 1700s. French, Dutch, British, Russian, documents created by different nations with different political interests. Look at the interior of Asia and you'll find remarkable consistency. Tartaria. Not a vague label, not a footnote, but an enormous territory stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific, from Siberia to the frontiers of China. These weren't speculative maps. They were practical tools for trade and military planning, maps merchants relied on, and maps whose accuracy mattered. And on many of them, you'll find cities marked, trade routes documented, and symbols indicating royal courts across Tartarian lands, showing that cartographers understood this region as an organized political entity with governmental structures. Then it vanishes. Over the late 1700s and early 1800s, Tartaria disappears from these same sources, with the label replaced as western portions become Russia, eastern portions become Qing China, and other regions become Ottoman territory. The land is redistributed among empires we recognize, but what's missing is any record of how the governmental structures shown on earlier maps ceased to exist. When empires fall, we have documentation. Rome's decline unfolds over centuries. Byzantium's end is meticulously recorded, and the Mongol Empire's fragmentation left clear records of succession disputes. But Tartaria, if it existed with the administrative systems these maps depict, should have comparable transition records, treaties, divisions, accounts of collapse. Instead, there's silence. And into that silence emerge new royal families, with genealogies stopping after a few generations, claiming territories that maps from a generation earlier labelled Tartarian, and building palaces using identical technical systems. All during the same period, Tartaria was being erased from maps. Three different kinds of evidence point to the same thing: genealogies that stop where they'd reveal connections, architecture that preserves shared technical knowledge, and maps documenting a vast political entity disappearing at the exact moment these families consolidated power. The official explanation says Tartaria was just a European label for unknown territory, not a real political entity. But that requires believing cartographers, capable of mapping coastlines and political boundaries across the world, suddenly became vague only when it came to the largest landmass on their maps, marking cities and royal courts for something that didn't exist. Or it requires accepting something else: that Tartaria did exist, that it had the governmental structures the maps document, and that when it was absorbed or dismantled during the 1700s, the families who inherited its territories also inherited its bloodlines and its technical knowledge, and that acknowledging this would have undermined dynasties that needed to present themselves as ancient, independent, and purely European. The genealogies were constructed to stop at the right moment. The architecture preserved what couldn't be written. The maps recorded what existed before it was erased. Three different records of the past, all showing the same pattern from different angles. Not separate mysteries, but one story coming into focus. Look at the symbols these families chose to represent themselves. The double-headed eagle appears in the heraldry of the Holy Roman Empire, the Russian Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and numerous German principalities. And we're told it was adopted independently, that it carried different meanings in different contexts, that symbols simply migrate and get reused over time. But heraldry doesn't work like casual decoration. When royal families select symbols, they're making deliberate statements about lineage, legitimacy, and inherited authority. The double-headed eagle isn't simple iconography. It's a complex heraldic device requiring specific artistic conventions to render correctly. The orientation of the heads, the symmetry, the placement of crowns, the positioning of talons and regalia. And across these empires, separated by geography and supposedly independent political histories, the symbol appears with remarkable consistency, not similarity but consistency. This isn't coincidence. When the same complex symbol appears across dynasties that claim separate origins, it signals inheritance. A shared symbolic language used because it already carried recognized meaning within a shared tradition. The same tradition their genealogies couldn't acknowledge, the same source that supplied their architectural knowledge, the same origins the maps documented before being redrawn. Heraldry is conservative by nature. Symbols persist precisely because they are inherited, not invented, which raises a simple but unsettling question. What heritage was being preserved visually while being erased genealogically? Now consider language. When European royalty married across borders, language is often presented as a barrier, with historical accounts describing princesses arriving unable to speak local languages, relying on translators, and taking years to adapt. And yet these same families conducted complex diplomatic negotiations, coordinated treaties, exchanged private correspondence, and managed dynastic alliances across borders with remarkable ease. The standard explanation points to Latin or French as diplomatic languages, and certainly those played a role, but historical records also contain references to other languages used in royal contexts, languages described vaguely as traditional or ancient, never clearly identified, never formally documented. Languages spoken privately rather than ceremonially, languages that don't appear in court transcripts or official correspondence. What if there was a shared language among these families that couldn't be publicly acknowledged because it would have connected them to origins their official histories needed to obscure? The same origins their genealogies hide, the same source their architecture reveals, the same civilization the maps show being erased. Language leaves fewer physical traces than buildings or maps, but it leaves absences. And those absences repeat here in the same pattern as everything else. Now look at Siberia, because this is where all of these threads converge physically. On 18th century maps, Siberia is not Russian territory. It's labelled as Tartarian, clearly and consistently across cartographic traditions produced by different European powers. Then, over a relatively short period in the 1700s, Siberia becomes Russian. Not through a clear sequence of documented wars, not through treaties we can examine in detail, but gradually and quietly, as if the transition required minimal explanation. The official narrative says Cossack explorers expanded eastward into sparsely populated land, encountering primitive indigenous groups that offered little resistance. But contemporary Russian sources from the expansion period describe encountering cities, not villages, not temporary settlements, but cities with stone construction, organized layouts, trade activity, and administrative order. Cities substantial enough to be recorded by explorers and officials, cities that should appear in modern historical narratives and leave archaeological traces. Where did they go? And who built them? If Siberia contained urban civilization significant enough to be documented in the 1600s and 1700s, whose civilization was it? Unless those cities were Tartarian, unless what Russia absorbed wasn't empty wilderness, but the remnants of what the maps had already been documenting for centuries. And if acknowledging that would raise questions about whether this was conquest or consolidation of territory already connected through bloodlines their genealogies couldn't trace, then those cities would need to disappear from history. The same thing the genealogies hide, the same thing the architecture reveals, the same thing the maps erase, the same thing the heraldry preserves. Siberia shows where it went physically. Now consider the fires. Between roughly 1650 and 1850, royal archives and administrative records across Europe burned with remarkable frequency. The royal palace in Madrid burns in 1734, destroying Habsburg records, just as Bourbon authority consolidates. Fires in German principalities eliminate genealogical documents during dynastic transitions. The Hanover State Archives suffer damage. Land registries, court records, and historical archives vanish. Some fires are inevitable. Buildings were wooden, heated by open flames, lit by candles, and accidents happened. But when you align the timing of these fires with political transitions, a pattern emerges. Records burn right before genealogical claims require verification. Archives are destroyed immediately after territorial changes, when older documents would contradict newly formalized narratives. And after each fire, reconstructed histories favor the newly established order. New genealogies appear cleaner, territorial claims become simpler, complications vanish. This doesn't require a single coordinated conspiracy. It only requires individuals at specific moments choosing not to preserve inconvenient evidence when opportunity presents itself. Disasters create cover, chaos creates permission, and the result is the same. The removal of records that would connect genealogies to erased territories, architecture to inherited knowledge, and symbols to shared ancestry. So what we're left with is not a collection of unrelated mysteries, but a single pattern visible through different forms of evidence. Genealogies that stop precisely where they'd reveal common origins. Architecture that preserves sophisticated technical knowledge without a visible developmental history. Maps that document a vast political entity and then erase it within a narrow historical window. Heraldry that maintains a shared symbolic language across supposedly independent dynasties. Language practices hinting at private communication systems that leave no official trace. Siberia showing where the territory went, and fires explaining how the paper trail was cleaned up. All of it points to the same conclusion. A civilization existed that governed enormous territory, maintained administrative structures, developed advanced construction knowledge, and was absorbed or dismantled during the 1700s and early 1800s. The families who inherited its lands also inherited its bloodlines, its technical expertise, and its symbolic traditions. But acknowledging that inheritance would have undermined dynasties that needed to present themselves as ancient, independent, and purely European. So genealogies were formalized to stop at the right moment. Maps were redrawn, cities vanished from accounts, and archives burned, leaving behind a sanitized version of history that served political legitimacy. I began this trying to understand why certain maternal lines couldn't be traced. I'm ending it, looking at architectural, cartographic, heraldic, linguistic, and geographic evidence, all pointing to the same thing from different angles, something that spanned continents, organized power at scale, and transmitted knowledge across generations. During the 1700s and 1800s, Tartaria was systematically removed from official history, while its descendants continued ruling under new genealogies. The evidence remains. The palaces still stand, built according to principles that appear fully formed. The maps still exist in archives, showing what cartographers recorded before labels changed. The heraldic symbols still display a common visual language. The genealogies still stop at exactly the point where they become inconvenient. Siberian records still reference cities official history says never existed. Walk into any palace built during this period and look at the precision, the scale, the engineering confidence, and ask yourself whether this knowledge emerged independently across rival dynasties within decades, or whether it came from a common source these dynasties inherited but couldn't acknowledge. Trace any royal maternal line back and watch where the documentation ends. Compare maps from 1700 to maps from 1800 And notice what disappeared. The families know their actual origins. The architecture preserves the technical inheritance. The maps document what existed before it was officially erased. The genealogies hide it by stopping at precisely the right moment. And somewhere in the gap between what official history claims and what the evidence shows, there is a civilization that built across continents, developed sophisticated systems, and maintained governmental structures. A civilization we've been taught never existed as anything more than a vague geographic label. But it did exist. The evidence still says so. And the reason it feels fragmented is because it was never meant to be seen all at once.